Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the economic impact of the war in Iran. Over the last few weeks, we've been talking a lot about oil prices, shipping, disruption, inflation, supply chains, and the growing risks to the global economy. But today I've got something different for you because we're now starting to get hard evidence directly from major global companies. We're getting quarterly earning reports, we're getting shareholder updates, we're getting statements from chief executives, and what's really interesting and also extremely worrying is that virtually every sector of the global economy is now reporting problems linked to what's happening in Iran. Cost increases, operational disruption, price hikes, supply shortages, margin pressure, shipping delays, and in some cases, companies are now openly warning investors that the situation is likely to get worse during the second quarter and the second half of 2026. So in today's video, we're going to go through all of that. And if anybody that's been missing my charts recently, don't worry, because I've got some really interesting ones for you today. We've got a breakdown of the different types of damage companies are reporting. We've got a sector by sector analysis showing which industries are being hit hardest. And we've also got estimated cost figures showing the billions of dollars of damage already being disclosed. But before we get into the details on all of that, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that red subscriber button? Really does help me with the algorithm and also puts a smile on my face. So thank you very much for doing that. Now, the reason this story is so important is because this is no longer just theoretical. This is no longer economists speculating about what might happen. This is now companies reporting actual damage, actual losses, actual financial pain. Reuters has analysed statements from 279 major companies around the world, and according to that analysis, the total cost already disclosed exceeds $25 billion, and that figure is rising every single day. In fact, every single minute of every day. And remember, these are only the companies that have announced that are publicly listed. These are only the businesses that are required to publish results. There are thousands and thousands of private companies all around the world that are also being hit by this situation. And in many cases, smaller businesses are actually more vulnerable because they don't have huge cash reserves, they don't have unlimited access to debt, they don't have large balance sheets, and they often don't have the pricing power to simply pass these costs on to consumers. So what we're seeing here is probably just the tip of the iceberg. Now, before we go any further, let's take a look at the first chart because this is incredibly revealing. This chart breaks down the different types of impact being reported by the 279 companies that Reuters has analysed. And the biggest category so far is direct financial damage. According to this data, 62 companies specifically referred to a financial hit in their latest reporting. Now, if we work that out, that's a percentage of around 22% of all of the companies surveyed. So more than 1 in 5 major global companies are now openly telling shareholders that this conflict is already damaging their finances. The next major category is operational changes. 45 companies reported operational disruption. That's just over 16%. And this is where things start to get really interesting because operational changes can mean all sorts of things. Companies rerouting shipments, factories changing production schedules, airlines cancelling routes, businesses sourcing materials from different suppliers, shipping companies taking longer routes around Africa, for example. All of these changes increase costs, and importantly, they reduce efficiency. And modern global business is built around efficiency. The entire global economy over the last 30 years has been designed around just-in-time delivery systems, low-cost energy, and predictable global trade routes. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important shipping corridors in the world. As we've discussed before, around 20% of global oil and gas usually passes through that region every single day. And once you disrupt that system, you create a domino effect right across the global economy. The next category on this chart is price hikes. 41 companies have already announced price increases. That's roughly 15%. And this is exactly what we've been discussing on the channel. These costs do not simply disappear. Eventually, they get passed on. Companies absorb them initially, margins then get squeezed, profits come under pressure, and ultimately many businesses pass these on in price increases, which means inflation. And that's why this situation is so dangerous for the global economy, because what's really interesting about this chart is that these aren't the only impacts being discussed. A number of companies have now withdrawn or cut guidance to the market. And for anybody that doesn't know what that means, guidance is effectively the forecast that companies provide to investors. So when companies start cutting guidance, what they're really saying is that they believe business conditions are deteriorating, and so they can't really forecast what's going to happen. We're also seeing profit warnings, sales warnings, surcharge fees being introduced. Some companies are limiting returns to shareholders. Others are warning about the impact on IPO activity and investment decisions. And there are also widespread supply chain changes taking place. Companies changing suppliers, changing shipping routes, changing sourcing arrangements, and all of that creates additional friction and additional costs inside the global economy. Because central banks were already struggling with inflation, interest rates are already high, consumers are already under pressure, and now are added a massive energy shock on top of that. And remember, oil was trading at around $60 a barrel at the start of this year. We're now above $110. That is an extraordinary move in incredible short space of time. And oil affects absolutely everything: transportation, manufacturing, chemicals, packaging, food, heating, electricity, air travel. Literally every single part of the economy is connected to energy. Now, the next chart is equally interesting because this breaks down the industries that are being impacted. And unsurprisingly, airlines are right at the top. 45 airline companies have now warned about the impact. And this makes complete sense. Jet fuel prices have surged. Flight routes have become more complicated. Insurance costs have increased. And in some cases, airlines are now having to reroute flights around dangerous airspace. All of that increases costs dramatically. And Reuters reports that the aviation industry alone has already disclosed $15 billion of additional costs. That is an absolutely enormous figure. And again, this is only what has been publicly disclosed so far. The next major sector is chemicals. 32 chemical companies are now reporting disruption. And this is another critical point because chemicals sit at the heart of modern manufacturing. Chemicals are used in plastics, packaging, industrial production, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, and consumer goods. So when chemical costs rise, those price increases spread right across the economy. But the really important point from this chart is that this isn't isolated to one or two industries. This is broad-based economic damage. Consumer goods companies are reporting problems. Oil and gas firms, automotive manufacturers, logistical businesses, material companies, retail, financial services, machinery manufacturers, food and beverage companies, energy firms, technology companies. Virtually every major part of the global economy is now being impacted in some way. And that's why I think this story is so important, because we're now moving beyond financial markets. This is now hitting the real world. Now let's move on to the third chart, because this is perhaps the most alarming of all. This chart estimates the actual financial damage that companies have disclosed so far. And as you can see, the airline industry is by far the worst affected so far. Airlines have disclosed $15 billion of additional costs. And again, this makes complete sense because, as we just discussed, jet fuel prices have surged and airline companies are having to deal with things like rerouting flights, increased insurance, and airspace restrictions. And all of that has dramatically increased their operating costs. The next biggest sector impacted is automotive and automotive supply chains. That sector so far has disclosed around $5.5 billion of additional costs. And again, modern vehicle manufacturing is incredibly dependent on a smooth global supply chain. Any disruption creates major operational problems because if you can't source one part, you can't complete your whole vehicle. Consumer goods companies have also disclosed around $2.4 billion of additional costs to date. Cruise and shipping businesses have announced $1.4 billion, and there are substantial impacts happening across multiple sectors simultaneously. But the really important point here is this: these are only the companies that have actually disclosed specific dollar figures. There are thousands of other companies around the world that have talked about disruption, cost increases, and operational problems without putting precise numbers on those impacts. So the real global economic hit is definitely going to be higher than $25 billion. It could be many, many, many multiples of that. It could be 10 or 100 times bigger. And of course, that figure is still rising every single day. And the quotes that we're now seeing from chief executives in the earnings calls are really revealing. One executive described the environment as highly unstable and unpredictable. Others have warned about deteriorating margins, supply chain disruption, and escalating logistics costs. Several companies have warned that they may have to continue increasing prices if oil remains at current levels. And this is where things become really worrying, because the first quarter results only capture the early stages of this crisis. Most of these companies are reporting results for a period when oil prices were still significantly lower than they are today. This is basically to the end of March. The conflict started on the 28th of February, so it really only includes 1 month. And many executives are now warning that the second quarter is likely to be materially worse. So if we've already seen $25 billion of disclosed costs, but actually much more than that, what happens if this situation continues throughout the summer? What happens if the Strait of Hormuz remains disrupted for the rest of this year? What happens if oil prices stay above $100 or $110 as they are at the moment? What happens if shipping costs continue to rise? And importantly, what happens if consumers finally start pulling back their spending due to inflation? Because at that point, you start creating a very dangerous economic cycle. Higher costs, higher prices, lower consumer spending, falling corporate profits, reduced investment, hiring freezes, and eventually layoffs. And we're already starting to see early warning signs. Reuters is reporting that some companies have already suspended dividends, cut production, delayed investment decisions, and started implementing defensive measures to protect their cash flows. And that is exactly what businesses do when they become worried about the future. They stop spending, they become cautious, and once enough companies start doing that simultaneously, economic growth slows. And the really important point here is that this isn't isolated to one country. This is a global issue. European companies are being hit, Asian companies are being hit, American companies are being hit, because this is fundamentally an energy and supply chain crisis. And as we've discussed in previous videos, bond markets around the world are now starting to react as investors worry about inflation remaining higher for longer. And this is another major concern because governments around the world already have enormous debt levels. So if inflation remains elevated and interest rates stay high, governments end up paying more interest on their debt, which puts additional pressure on public finances. So this conflict is now creating problems at every level of the economy. Consumers, businesses, governments, financial markets, supply chains, and energy markets. And this is why I've repeatedly said on the channel that the world may be underestimating the long-term consequences of this conflict, because at the moment there still appears to be a major impasse between the USA and Iran. There is no obvious solution in terms of this conflict. There's no clear sign as to when it's going to end, and there's certainly no visibility yet as to when the Strait of Hormuz is likely to fully return to normal, if ever. Maybe it never will. And the longer this situation continues, the greater the damage is going to be. More costs for companies, more inflation, more supply chain disruption, more pressure on consumers, and ultimately higher prices for virtually everything. Because as we've said before, energy affects every single part of the economy: transportation, manufacturing, food, packaging, electricity, heating, shipping, air travel, everything. And if companies and countries are forced to permanently reroute supply chains, reroute shipping lanes, build alternative infrastructure, or source energy from more expensive locations, then the long-term cost base of the global economy rises. And that potentially means structurally higher inflation for years. And if this situation drags on for long enough, there is also a very real risk that it ultimately pushes the global economy into recession. And that's why these earnings reports matter so much, because they are giving us real-time evidence of what is actually happening inside the global economy. This isn't theory, this isn't forecasts, this isn't predictions. actual companies reporting actual damage. And remember, this is only the beginning. We are still in the early stages of these disclosures. Many companies haven't reported yet. Second quarter numbers are likely to be worse, and if oil prices remain at the current levels, the pressure is going to continue building. So this is definitely a story that we'll continue monitoring very closely. So I'll keep you posted on any further news, but hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, or maybe you didn't like it but you thought it was interesting, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already.